All right, we on back there we go. All right, everyone. Kids, third grade and under, you are welcome to head downstairs for children's church. You're welcome to head downstairs or hang out with us. We're gonna talk about something different today. So I hope you all are having a great, whatever this time of the year is for us here in Alaska. I love living here in Alaska, but I've told many of you before, I don't like everything about Alaska. One of the things I don't like about living in Alaska is the month of March. Because in most places, I really don't, I know. In most places, March is like nice, and it's kind of starting to warm, and things are blooming. That doesn't happen until May around here, and you all know. Don't give me that look. I just don't. I appreciate what's coming, but it's not here yet. It drives me nuts. Well, we're going to look at a place in the Bible that gets that kind of a feeling a lot of the times. We're going to be in the book of Obadiah today, and I've been asking my students down in our student ministry for a number of weeks now to read the book of Obadiah. So I hope some of them actually did. If they haven't, well, tough. But we're going to go through it anyway, and we're going to share it together and see one of these books of the Bible that hardly ever gets talked about, ever gets touched, and what value it has for you and me today. And it has a lot. Now, if you're not familiar with the book of Obadiah, it's very, very, very short. It's only 21 verses. It's the shortest book in the Old Testament. It's one of the shortest books in the entire Bible, and it's very, very different than most of the books of the Bible. Instead of being a narrative about Jesus, or you're not going to find David and Goliath here, or anything like that. No giant fish or anything like that. What you're going to find is a message to a particular people. And again, unlike most things we read in the scriptures, it primarily does not have to do with the people of Israel. This is a book that's directed toward a completely different group, and yet it has a very, very, very important message for the people of God, both then and now. But again, this is one of those books that just it gets overlooked. It gets passed over. It's one of those flyover areas. Some of us are from like Colorado, Kansas, Iowa. Those places that people don't stop. My mom right now is in Albin, Wyoming. Who here knows where Albin, Wyoming is? Anyone? I didn't think so. I do because I went to college there, and I grew up going there with my dad, right near LaGrange, Wyoming, where I went to college. It's an awesome place, but it's literally in the middle of nowhere. She doesn't even have cell service right now. It's exactly awesome. It's one of those amazing places where you can literally keep your phone on but not ever get a text. It's unbelievable. Well, this is kind of what Obadiah is. And one of the things we've been doing with our students recently is we started a study in looking at the various books of the Bible and giving a basic overview of them. We started with a TED Talk. Everyone knows what a TED Talk is, right? I'm getting a bunch of blanks here. Okay, well, there's this thing called a TED Talk where people get up. It's a global thing where experts in different fields or people that have had different experiences get up and they give about a 10-minute talk on their subject, and they're using all kinds of different seminars and things. And one of these TED Talks that we looked at was from this guy named David, who was one of the writers for a game show called the American Bible Challenge. In fact, you can go today on Netflix and watch the first 2 seasons of the American Bible Challenge with Jeff Foxworthy. And this was a game show that was directed toward conservative, believing evangelical Christians. And this guy was one of the guys who got together with a group of other people and wrote the questions for this game show. And one of the things that he shares in that TED Talk is how they were basically restricted to about 10% of the Bible that they could even draw questions from. And he actually had a picture up on the screen with all the books of the Bible, and the vast majority of them were just crossed out. We can't use that. That's useless information. It's meaningless to us, to our audience. And the whole time I'm sitting there thinking, this is a game show for Christians, and you're saying we can't use most of the Bible. And even the parts that he was willing to use, they were willing to use, they can only use little parts of it. And he had a very negative view of most of the scriptures. And you know what? A lot of us have that view. We're not really willing to say it most of the time, but we really do. We kind of skip over Habakkuk and Obadiah and Philemon, those kinds of books. I mean, they're there in the Bible. We know we do a sword drill, we can get there. Some of us can. We had a thing this morning. Some of us can. These guys can. I can't. And where's that little? And these guys right here too. They did really, really good this morning. We can get there if we're asked to give a list of the books of the Bible. We know they're there. But if we're actually asked to give a basic understanding of what the book's even about, to be honest, most of us couldn't even do that. And so maybe ask yourself this question. If I asked you to share, what is the book of Habakkuk about? Could you give an answer? Well, today, one of the things I want us to be able to do is at least give you that much information about the book of Obadiah. So if a quiz question ever comes up, randomly around here, if someone ever stops you in the hallway and says, "What's Obadiah about?" Because that happens frequently around here, you can give a very short answer. It's about Edom. Who knows what Edom? Okay. Look, I got one hand in the back. Okay. The book of Obadiah is written to a people, a nation called Edom. And this is a nation that has a lot of history with Israel. If you're familiar with Israel's history from pretty much the time of, especially David, Saul, David, the kingdom, early kingdom of Israel, forward, there's a lot of interaction between Israel and Edom. And there's various times in which one nation has rule over the other, one nation is attacking each other. There's a very serious conflict between the people of Israel and the people of Edom. And it's a relationship that goes way back. It starts back in the book of Genesis with the first offspring of Abraham. You have Isaac and his brother. No, Jacob. Abraham's descendants. Thank you. Isaac and Ishmael. There's a divergence there. The line that gets eventually the nation of Israel goes through Isaac. And then his two children are Jacob and Esau. And Esau and Jacob have a very contentious relationship. They're actually twins, but they don't get along. A lot of twins seem to get along, but these two don't. And if you know the story, if you were in our Awana group a couple weeks ago, my wife was doing a great job telling the story of Jacob and Esau. And last week, Goliath showed up. And I mean, literally, he showed up, and the kids were shooting marshmallows at him. And it was huge. It was great. And the relationship between Jacob and Esau is very, very strained to the point where basically Esau wants to kill his brother Jacob. And Jacob has to flee, and he's gone for well over a decade and finally returns, and there's a restoration of that relationship. But from that point, these two individuals branch off into two different people groups. The descendants of Jacob are known as the Israelites, and they end up developing into the kingdom of Israel. And then the descendants of Esau end up becoming known as the Edomites. Edom is actually just the word for man. It's the same word for Adam. It's Edom. But Esau is really connected with the idea of something red. The porridge, if you know the story of Jacob and Esau, the porridge that he made, the color of his hair. And eventually, actually, this kind of the culture of Edom becomes associated with this kind of ruddy, it's kind of like the pews. It's not really red, it's orange, I know that. But it's that kind of thing. And in fact, this is the area of Edom. You can actually go there today and see the remnants of this nation, Edom, in places like Petra. And most of us never get to go to Petra. I got to go to Israel in 2017 and had an opportunity to extend our trip by 8 days, and we were going to go spend 5 days down around Petra, and it didn't work out, and I was totally bummed out. But someday I would love to go there. But most of us have probably seen this. Anyone know where? I got a smirk already. Okay. If you've ever watched the Indiana Jones series, in the third movie, Indiana Jones and his dad, Sean Connery, that was his name in the movie, but Sean Connery and whatever his name is, Han Solo, end up going to go to Petra, and this is where they find the bad guys, the Nazis, and they have to fight them and stuff. They actually shot that scene going into that last scene at Petra, and so you've actually seen most of us, I'm assuming, have seen this. That is the ancient civilization of Edom, and that is who the book of Obadiah is addressed to. But that relationship between the people of Israel and Edom was very strained. And although this is an awesome place you can go to today, it has a very rough history. The people of Israel and Edom were constantly in conflict with one another, even though they were a related nation. There's a lot of other nations around Israel through its early history. There's Ammon and Moab, but they're not related. They're very distant people groups. But Edom is a related group, and there's a family dynamic to that relationship. And even past the time of Obadiah, we get to the book of Malachi, and this relationship continues, and there's a continued strain between the relationships. And yes, there's a lot of history to it, but there's also a decision that's connected to this strained relationship, and it's actually God's decision. In the book of Malachi, God refers to the love that he expressed toward Jacob and his descendants, the nation of Israel, and how he, quote, hated Esau and did not bless, did not choose, did not work in Edom the way he had in Israel. And God uses that decision as the backdrop for his great shellacking he gives the Israelites in the book of Malachi. Remember what I did for you. So what's your deal? It's basically the theme of the book of Malachi. So there's your answer if you ever want to throw that back out. If you ever ask a question about Malachi. It's a difficult relationship, but this is who this book is written to. Now, when was this written? What had been done to bring this book about? So that's a complicated question because we're not given a lot of detailed information in the book. In fact, it starts with the vision of Obadiah. There are at least 12 Obadiahs in the Old Testament. So we don't even know exactly which one it is. However, if you read through the book and you realize what it's referring to, this was probably written right around the year 580, 585, somewhere in there, because what it describes is the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, the fleeing of people, the exile of the people of Jerusalem, and their eventual restoration. So pretty much everyone that I'm aware of through Christian history has pointed primarily to that dating. It's right there around the destruction of the southern kingdom of Israel, known as Judah. The northern kingdom of Israel is gone by this point. It's been gone for over 150 years. The southern kingdom, the kingdom that is the remnant of David's kingdom, his descendants are still ruling this kingdom. And around the year 586, 587, an empire called Babylon destroys Jerusalem, destroys that kingdom, takes its people away in exile. And something else happens in the midst of that. And that's what this book is about. And so if you read down through this book, again, it's not very long. I encourage you to do it. And we're not going to be able to get to everything here, but you'll notice a lot of different things. In fact, the actual charge of what they did starts at verse 10. It says, because of the violence done to your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. And on that day you stood aloof, on the day when strangers carried off his wealth, and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem. You were like one of them. But do not gloat over the day of your brother in the day of his misfortune. Do not rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their ruin. And do not boast in the day of their distress, and so on and so forth it goes. What occurred here evidently was the people of Edom joined in on the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in the kingdom of Judah. There had been a strained relationship before, and there had been conflict before, but now a foreign entity had come and destroyed their relative nation. They joined in on it. In fact, if you keep reading there, not only did they join in on the destruction, not only did they participate in some way, but even there, verse 14, and do not stand at the crossroads to cut off his fugitives, and do not hand over Israel's survivors in the day of their distress. Not only had they participated in this event, but they had even stood back, had cut off the refugees, had captured them, and had sold them back to the Babylonians in different ways. And God looks at this situation and issues a vision of judgment. But here, real quick, we got to ask a very, 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 very important question. How can God do this? How can God judge Edom for participating in a judgment that he had decreed? You read part of it together just a minute ago in the book of Isaiah. God speaks of this time frame when the people of Israel, when the nation of Israel would be destroyed, they would be disbanded. And it says, we read it twice there, the word there used is decreed. Destruction is decreed for Israel. Now that would not happen for about another 250 years. But it happened. Destruction is decreed in righteousness. Well, if you read the book of Jeremiah, that book is basically Jeremiah living through those events. The nation of Judah, the city of Jerusalem, is being destroyed. And basically the message of Jeremiah to his people in his day and his context is, do not resist this judgment because this is coming from God. You cannot escape it. It is decreed. Submit to it and it will be better for you. And his people will not listen to him. And so Jerusalem is completely destroyed. Temple is burned down. It's cataclysmic. It is a decreed destruction. God has foretold it. He is determined. And yet God then looks at Edom, who participates in fulfilling that very judgment, and then this book will judge them. In fact, read verse 4. Though you soar aloft like the eagle, though your nest is set among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. How can he do this? He had decreed it. This is not the only time we see this. It's a very good question, but this is not a odd situation, to be honest with you. Acts chapter 4. Christians sat there looking at their situation their day right after the death of Jesus, and they asked the question, they make the statement that what had happened to Jesus in Jerusalem, and they mentioned the characters, the Gentiles, the Jews, Herod and Pontius Pilate, did what your hand and your will predestined to take place, and yet they were held accountable for that. In Genesis chapter 50, Joseph looks at his brothers and says with the exact same verb and terminology, what you intended for evil, God intended for good, to save lives. We all know the story of Joseph, right? What you intended for evil, God intended for good. Not God made something good of it, not God worked something out, not God came up with plan B. No. What you intended, God intended for very different purposes. In Isaiah chapter 10, we got to go there again. So if you got your Bible, go to Isaiah chapter 10. I would really, really, really encourage you to read Isaiah chapter 10 carefully in detail. And no, got to do some backstory history on it, but Isaiah chapter 10 is so important to the entire history of Israel, and is so applicable to you and me today. As God decrees the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel and the invasion of the southern kingdom, he tells them that they're going to survive, but the northern kingdom will not. And yet in the midst of it, you have to recognize what God says about this coming invasion. God says, I'm the one bringing it. In fact, he compares the nation of Assyria, the king of Assyria, the armies of Assyria, and all that they would do to a sword or an axe in his hand. God says, I wield it like an axe against you, Israel, his own people. And yet, let me get there with you. And yet we read this, Isaiah chapter 10, look at verse 5. O Assyria, the rod of my anger, the staff in their hands is my fury. Against a godless nation, Israel, I send Assyria. And against the people of my wrath, Israel, I command him, Assyria, to take spoil and seize plunder and to tread down like to tread them down like the mire in the streets. But he, Assyria, does not so intend, and his heart does not think so, but in his heart is to destroy and to cut off many nations. And look at verse 12. And so when the Lord has finished all his work in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, he will punish the speech of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the boastful look in his eyes. But Assyria just did what God commanded him to do. And yet God can then look at him and judge him for the intention, the purpose of his heart. And here in Obadiah, we have a parallel situation. A people joined in on a judgment that God had decreed, had determined, and yet God can then look at them and judge them too. And I want you to see why. Verse 12, but do not gloat over the day of your brother. Do not rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their distress. Do not enter the gate, verse 13, of my people in the day of their calamity. Do not gloat over their disaster. Do not loot his wealth. Do not stand at the crossroads and cut off his refuge. Do not hand over survivors in the day of distress. The judgment is not arbitrary. It is not, well, I just don't like you. The judgment is your heart was arrogant in doing this. You did not do this to obey me. You did not do this in order to accomplish my purpose. You did this to enrich yourself and to boast over my people. And so God says, I will bring you down. Verse 4 again. However, we get to verse 15. There's a very, very important statement there in verse 15. While this letter is addressed to the nation of Edom, at verse 15 it says this, "For the day of the Lord is near upon the nations. The day of the Lord is near upon all the nations." And here you have a pause for a second as God directs this judgment oracle toward Edom. He reminds Edom and the primary recipients of the letter, the people of Israel, that this is not just about Edom. This is about everyone. Judgment had come upon their nation, Judah. They had come upon their cousins to the north, Israel. They had come upon, at this point, the Assyrian Empire is gone, by the way. Babylon had destroyed that one. Judgment had come upon them. We read about that in the book of Jonah. If you ever read the book of Jonah, you got to read the book of Nahum after that, because you need both to fulfill finish the story. That's already done. But the day of the Lord, which we read about throughout the Old Testament, a day in which God will bring about the end, in which God will judge every person, every nation, God will set up his kingdom. That day is coming for every nation, and as you have done, it shall be done to you, and your deeds shall return upon your head. That is a warning to everyone who reads this book, whether it's Babylonian, Edomite, Moabite, Israelite, Judean, didn't matter. The day of the Lord is coming. But for Edom, what is the decree? What is the judgment? Well, again, you can look at verse 4. "I will bring you down from your lofty heights." Again, you saw the pictures there of Petra. Some of those fortresses that they built in that area that you can still go see today are really well positioned. Some of them are up on cliffs. There's these massive mountain cliffs in that part of the world. Has anyone ever been to Masada? I'm the only one that's been to Masada now. Sorry, okay. If you ever get to go to Israel, you've got to go to Masada to just kind of get a picture of what a desert fortress looks like in this part of the world. That is what they had there in Edom. They had multiple fortresses kind of like that, carved into the rock, just like you saw the picture there. But they're up on these cliffs, and it's extremely hard to conquer a position like that. And yet God says, "I will bring you down from those fortifications. I will destroy you." And then look at verse 8 and 9. Look how extensive this is. Again, this is about the year 580, 585, somewhere in there. "Will I not on that day, declares the Lord." There you have another statement there. We see this several times. "Declares the Lord, to destroy the wise men of Edom and the understanding of Mount Esau. And your mighty men will be dismayed, O Teman, so that every man from Mount Esau will be cut off by slaughter." You have a parallel statement there at the end of verse 18. "For there shall be no survivor from the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken." It is a terrifying vision. It is a terrifying oracle, a terrifying judgment, and yet there is so much more to it. Yes, there is a judgment decreed against this particular nation, a judgment that came true, by the way. A few decades later, sometime in the, got to do it backwards because of the calendar, in the late 500s BC, man, math. I don't do well at math. That's why I leave that to my wife. I do. In the late 500s, we don't know exactly when, but the nation of Edom is gone. It just simply disappears. And we seem to know who did it, a group of people called the Nabateans, an eastern enemy from the desert regions, basically early Arabs. That's how we would kind of identify them today, and early people from the desert area of Arabia. But Edom just kind of disappears. It's a strong, powerful, small, but powerful country at the end of the time of Judah, but within 50 years, it's gone. The culture, the language, the people are just gone. For the Lord has spoken. That was the judgment. But what is the promise? This is where most of us get excited. We really ought to be about everything here, but what is the promise of this book? Because again, remember the situation. as the survivors of Jerusalem are fleeing their capital city, as they are running for their lives, and they are going to places like Edom and Moab and Egypt. Jeremiah, by the way, is taken to Egypt, and we believe he dies there following the same event. What good is this to them? The people of God are suffering. The people of God are fleeing. They are refugees from their country, from their capital, from their homes. What good is it to them? Okay, great. God, you're going to judge them someday. Most of these people who heard this probably didn't even live to see it. Well, the value is there's a lot more. There's a promise of judgment, but there's a promise of restoration as well to God's people. Really starts there in verse 15, but let's go to verse 17. In contrast to the destruction that will come upon Mount Esau, or Edom, in verse 17, in Mount Zion, or Jerusalem, there shall be those who escape. And that city shall be holy, and the house of Jacob shall possess their own possession. So point number one there, what is the promise? Number one, restoration. They shall possess their own land again. And guess what? It happened in history. It took about 70 years, but they came back. Verse 18, and the house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, but the house of Esau, or Edom, shall be stubble, and they shall burn them and consume them, and there shall be no survivors for the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. And then verse 19. Verse 19 is one of those verses, it's one of those yucky breakup season verses. People read it, they don't really see the value in it. Verse 19 is really cool because it identifies the various regions of the nation of Judah. Basically, it's saying, from sea to shining sea, from the mountains to the prayer. That's this kind of verse right here, verse 19. And those of the Negeb, that's southern Judah, shall possess Mount Esau to the south. And those of Shephelah to the west in Judah shall possess the land of the Philistines to the west. And they shall possess the land of Ephraim to the north, and the land of Samaria. And Benjamin shall possess the Gilead. Benjamin was the northeastern corner of the nation of Judah, and Gilead is that part of Israel that was over the Jordan River to the east. So from the north, south, east, and west, not only will there be a restoration of the people of God, but there will be a recompense, not only from Edom, but from the Philistines, from Samaria, from Israel, and from Gilead. In verse 20, the exiles of this host of the people of Israel shall possess the land of the Canaanites, as far as Zarephath, and the exiles of Jerusalem who are in Zarephath shall possess the cities of the Negeb. Basically, from, what can you use? Minneapolis to Houston. That's north-south reference there. Israel will get their land back. They're destroyed right now. They're going off in exile. One day it'll come for Edom, but Edom will never recover. Israel will. Why? Because they are my people. Because God had chosen Jacob and not Esau, because God had chosen Israel and not Edom. God had made a choice, and he was going to bring these things about. And then verse 21. We had our students, this is one of our sword drill verses this morning. And saviors shall go up to Mount Zion to rule Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's. Two other R's there. So we have restoration, recompense, renown. Israel will rule this enemy that right now has betrayed them. And then you have a reign, a king. There will be saviors. You see that there in verse 21. Same word for judges, deliverers, the judges of the Old Testament. Same word for them. There will be champions, heroes in Jerusalem who will reign over Edom, but the kingdom belongs to the Lord. Very loose comparison. I don't know if I should even do this, but some people have drawn the comparison to the idea of Romans chapter 8. We are more than conquerors through Christ. It has nothing to do with Obadiah or Edom, anything like that, but the idea of the people of God one day ruling and reigning with him. This is an early prototype, an early vision, a type of that. There will be conquerors, saviors, judges who will reign over this kingdom, but the kingdom belongs to the Lord. In fact, it really draws to my mind Psalm 110, the most commonly quoted verse about Jesus in the New Testament, Psalm 110, where David says, "My Lord, the Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool." You ever notice in that verse, it doesn't happen all at once. It takes time. There are events in history that take place, but one day, every enemy of Christ will be subjected to him, and he will reign over them. And this right here is one of those early steps. And you and I are living through the next step in our generation. And that there is the value and the promise to us. The people of God are marching off in their own day, to their own judgment, to their own life, their own suffering, their own situations, their own crises. And yet the promise of God is one day I will restore. Even as I have judged you, I will restore you. Even as I have brought calamity, I will provide grace. Even as I took a kingdom away from you, where once you were comfortable and rich, and I took your country away, one day I will provide a better country, a better kingdom. And so the value of Obadiah is simply this, the idea that justice will prevail, not a justice as so many of us think of it, but an eternal, sure, righteous justice. And this is a concept that our culture has completely lost. And yet it is so important because as you and I sit here today, and we know about what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. We know about this attack, that bombing, this school shooting. Where is our hope for justice? As these people marched off to a 70-year exile, was there hope in justice that someone else would come along and conquer Russia, or excuse me, Babylon? That someone bigger, meaner, badder would come along? It was not. It was that God's promise would actually happen. And they may not see it. Many of them did not. Jeremiah speaks more about this than anyone else. In fact, the book of Jeremiah is the largest book in the Bible, material-wise, not chapter-wise. And it has largely to do with this event. Jeremiah never saw any of it. Saw the destruction, never saw the restoration, never saw the remnant return, never saw so much of what God promised through him. And yet, the certainty that he has is astounding. And these people here, as they march off, are given this. Justice will be done. Whether in Ukraine or Russia, in China or Taiwan, in France or Australia, or in America, God will judge and his justice will prevail. That is the promise. And he can only promise that because he reigns over this world. Did you notice there how many times it says, God has spoken? Thus declares the Lord. The Lord has spoken. If you and I cannot trust what God has said, then there's no reason for us to be here today. And there is no reason to sing, there is no reason to hope. But if we can hope in what the Lord has said, even as these people did in their day, if we can do that in our day, then there is a hope. And as we're about to sing, he can hold us fast. Let's pray together. Lord, thank you so much for this day. Even here in March, even here in breakup season, your grace and your goodness, your mercy, your compassion is great. Your patience with our world, with our nation, with other nations, with us as individuals is astounding. And yet here we get a glimpse into a moment where your justice, your judgment is unleashed. Father, may we have the fortitude and the heart and the integrity to look at that and recognize how good that is when your justice prevails. You judged a people. You judged a nation rightly, as they deserved, as you have done many times through history. And yet, what is so often lost is how astounding it is that you bothered to promise a restoration to another nation. Not one that deserved it, not one that earned it, one that instead deserved a just judgment that itself was experienced at this time, and yet your love and your compassion is extended to those same people even then, and this promise is brought to them. One day, God will make it right. One day, God will restore. One day, God will recompense. One day, I will reign. And I will live with my people. A better country is coming, a better kingdom, a better world. And Father, we look forward to the day when the enemies of your Son are made like a footstool, and they are brought in subjection, when every enemy of the cross kneels before it, as they see the one who died upon it now standing as a king with a kingdom and with a people. And Lord, we rejoice in the promise that we get to participate in that. And that these promises extend to us. A kingdom is coming. A king is coming. And we look forward to that day. So Father, give us the fortitude and the courage to live in light of that. Whatever you bring about in our time, in our nation, in our family, in our own life, may we hold fast to these words. The Lord has spoken. May we believe that and live it. Father, for these things we ask in the name of your Son, whom you provided and who is returning again. Amen.